welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story Whispers in the Dark. I never thought I'd be working the night shift at a fast food restaurant, but life has a way of steering you toward places you never thought you'd end up. I worked at a Subway in a small town, the kind of place where the only real excitement happens when the local football team wins a big game, and even then, it's a muted celebration. Most nights, it was just me, my co-workers, and the hum of the lights above, with the occasional customer trickling in for a late night sandwich. But there was something about that store. Something strange that started happening after the sun dipped below the horizon. At first, it was small things, objects out of place, noises when there shouldn't have been any, and a general feeling of unease that only seemed to surface when the night shift began. The strange part? No one talked about it. Not at first. It was like we all had this unspoken agreement to just carry on as if nothing was happening, even though something was. It wasn't until a few months into working there that I really started to feel the weight of it. The store wasn't particularly old. It had been built about 10 years ago, and aside from the usual wear and tear of a high-traffic fast food place, it seemed like just any other Subway. But there were things that never seemed right, especially at night. My manager, Carla, was one of the first to notice it. She had been there for a couple of years before I started, and she always worked the evening shift. I remember the first time she brought it up. "Have you ever felt something weird in here?" Carla had asked one night as we were finishing up a particularly busy evening. It was around 9 p.m., and the usual late-night crowd had already come and gone. The store was quiet, but there was a heaviness in the air that I couldn't explain. I looked at her, raising an eyebrow. She was busy organizing the condiment station and didn't make eye contact. "Something weird? Like what?" I replied, trying to keep the mood light. She sighed and wiped her hands on her apron. "I don't know how to explain it. But after 8 p.m., when it gets really quiet, I start hearing things. Like footsteps. Sounds like someone walking around in the back. But I'm the only one here." She paused for a moment, as if weighing her next words. "And sometimes the equipment, like the oven or the toaster, turns on by itself. You know, when no one's there to touch it." I chuckled, not fully believing her. "Maybe you're just hearing things. The place is old. You get used to the creaks and pops." But Carla didn't laugh. She just stared at me, her face pale. "Maybe. But I swear, it's not just in my head. I'm telling you. Something's off in this store." I didn't take it seriously then. But after a few more nights, I started to notice things too. Small things. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The sound of the radio turning on by itself when no one had touched it. The cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, making the back storage room feel like a freezer in the middle of summer. And the way the lights above the counter flickered, especially between 8 and 11 p.m. It was always the same hours, and it felt like something, or someone, was watching. One night, things escalated. It was a quiet Monday, and I was working with Stacy, a co-worker who had only been at the store for a few weeks. We were cleaning up after the last of the customers had left, doing the usual nightly duties, wiping down the tables, restocking the bread, cleaning the bathrooms. The store was dark except for the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting an eerie glow over everything. Stacy was in the back, washing dishes, while I was in the front, sweeping the floor. Everything seemed normal until I heard a noise, a soft thump, followed by the unmistakable sound of something metal scraping across the counter. I stopped sweeping and looked around, expecting to see Stacy, but she was still in the back, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the sink. There was no one else in the store. "Stacy?" I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. She didn't answer, so I walked toward the counter. The toaster, which had been off just moments ago, was now buzzing, its orange light glowing brightly. I stepped closer, confused. And before I could reach out to turn it off, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back room. My heart skipped a beat. Stacy couldn't have come out that quickly, and there was no way anyone else was in the store. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps came closer, slow and deliberate, and I couldn't move, rooted to the spot like a deer caught in headlights. The door to the back room swung open, and Stacy appeared, looking just as surprised as I felt. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting around the store. "Did you hear that?" Yeah, I said, my voice shaky. "The toaster just turned on by itself, and I heard footsteps. I thought you were still in the back." Stacy shook her head, her eyes wide. "I was. I swear, I didn't leave." We stood there, staring at the toaster, which had now stopped buzzing, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. Neither of us moved. The store felt like it was holding its breath. After a long, uncomfortable moment, Stacy muttered, "Let's just finish up and get out of here." We both hurried to finish cleaning, avoiding each other's gaze. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. When we locked up and finally left the store that night, neither of us said much. But from then on, things started getting worse. A few days later, things escalated even further. It was a Friday, and I was working the night shift alone. Stacy had called in sick, and Carla was off that night, leaving me to handle everything on my own. I didn't mind, it was a slow night, and I figured I could get in and out with no issues. Around 9 p.m., the store was as quiet as usual. I was just finishing putting the bread away when I heard it, a faint tapping sound from the back of the store. It was subtle at first, like someone gently knocking on the wall. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I turned to look toward the back room, my heart racing. I knew no one was supposed to be here. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and I froze. My body went cold, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I pulled it from my pocket. Just as I was about to call Carla, the lights above me flickered violently, plunging the store into darkness. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my chest. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. But when I turned back toward the counter, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The sandwich station, where we prepared food, was a mess. All the ingredients were scattered across the counter, as if someone had thrown them around. The bread was torn open, and the sandwich cutters were all over the floor. And in the center of the chaos, there was a single, freshly made sandwich, sitting on the counter, untouched. I knew I hadn't made it. I hadn't touched it at all. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? But who could have done this? I was alone. The store was empty. The lights flickered again, and this time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my purse, slammed the door behind me, and ran to my car. I didn't stop running until I was safely in my vehicle, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the store. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The thought of that sandwich, perfectly made and left on the counter, haunted me. It felt wrong, unnatural, even. The next day, I went into work early, hoping to brush it off. But when I walked into the store, I saw that the sandwich station had been cleaned. The mess was gone, and everything was back in place. I couldn't explain it. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still here. Watching. I still work at the subway. But now, I never work alone, especially not during the night shift. And I always leave before 11 p.m., no matter what. I'm not sure what's haunting the store, but I know one thing for sure, I don't want to find out. The strange occurrences haven't stopped. They still happen, every night, without fail. And as much as I try to ignore it, I know deep down that whatever is there in the dark isn't finished with us yet. And it's only a matter of time before it makes its move again. Story: The Lurking Shadow of La Lablesse. In the sleepy village of St. Margaret's, nestled deep in the hills of a small Caribbean island, the sun never fully chased away the shadows. The residents of this isolated community were accustomed to hearing eerie stories whispered by elders, tales passed down through generations like the wind-carried scent of salt and earth. The most chilling of these tales was that of La Lablesse, a creature from folklore said to haunt the darkened forest edges, luring lonely men to their doom. But for most of the village, La Lablesse was nothing more than a bedtime story, a cautionary tale told to keep children from wandering too far into the woods after dark. The village itself was a quiet patchwork of modest homes and meandering dirt roads, surrounded by thick forest that seemed to grow wilder with each passing year. While the houses were clustered near the center, many of the villagers lived on the outskirts, in small homes that had been passed down through families for generations. One such house belonged to a man named Mark Henderson, who had inherited the property from his late grandfather. Mark was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s who had recently moved back to the village after several years in the city, seeking solace after a messy divorce. His uncle, Charles, still lived in the family home as well, a quiet man who had worked long hours in the local factory for most of his life. Mark had never been one for superstition, nor had he ever paid much attention to the old stories. But living in the house again, with its creaking floorboards and heavy silence at night, left him feeling unnervingly aware of the darkness that surrounded him. The old house, though beautiful, had a way of making him feel small, trapped in the past, with memories of his childhood flooding back at odd moments. It was in the fall of 1987, a year after Mark had moved back, that he first began to notice strange things happening around the house. It started small, objects out of place, a shadow passing through the corner of his eye, the sound of footsteps echoing through the hall when no one was there. He dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the house's age and his own overactive imagination. After all, the village had been built on old grounds, and superstition ran deep here. But as the months went by, the occurrences became more frequent, and Mark's growing unease could not be ignored. Charles, Mark's uncle, was a man of routine. He worked the night shift at a factory on the edge of the village and often came home late, usually between midnight and 1 in the morning. Charles was an old hand at night shifts, having worked them for years, and he wasn't easily shaken. But one night, Mark noticed that his uncle was different. He seemed jumpy, looking over his shoulder as if someone, or something, was following him. When Mark asked what was wrong, Charles only gave a strained smile and muttered, "Just tired. That's all." But Mark could tell something wasn't right. Charles was not the type to talk about his feelings, but when Mark pressed him further, his uncle's eyes darkened, and he whispered, "I've been hearing things, strange things. At night. Sounds like someone's walking behind me, following me through the halls. It's the same every night. It's getting harder to ignore." Mark tried to reassure him, dismissing it as the effects of exhaustion. "You've been working too much," he said. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you." But deep down, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had once felt familiar and comforting, now seemed to be alive with a malevolent presence. One night, as Mark was sitting in the living room, reading a book to pass the time, he heard a faint sound from the hallway, a soft creaking, followed by a low rustling. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then the sound grew louder, and the unmistakable noise of footsteps echoed through the house. His heart began to race, and he stood up slowly, inching toward the hallway. As he approached the stairs, he froze. A shadow, a tall, slender figure, was standing at the top of the staircase. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The figure did not move, did not acknowledge his presence. Without thinking, Mark took a step forward, his mind racing with questions. Who could it be? Was it his uncle? But then, the figure turned slightly, and Mark saw a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold, a hoof. Not a human foot, but a hoof like that of a cow, curled and twisted, pale in the dim light. In that moment, everything he had ever heard about La Lablesse rushed back to him, and a chill ran down his spine. La Lablesse, the woman with the beautiful body, the hideous face, and the cow hoof. The myth his grandfather had once told him as a child, about the woman who lured men to their doom in the forest. The creature that had become nothing more than a dark, haunting bedtime story, now suddenly real in his own home. Mark couldn't move. The figure seemed to sway as if it was unsure whether to approach him or retreat into the shadows. His mind raced, but his body refused to obey him. The creature turned away, disappearing into the darkness at the top of the stairs, and Mark snapped out of his trance. He sprinted back to the living room and slammed the door shut, locking it behind him. He called out for his uncle, but the house was eerily silent. Charles didn't return until hours later, but when he did, Mark could see the same fear in his uncle's eyes that had taken hold of him earlier that night. Mark, still shaken by the experience, told Charles everything: the shadow, the hoof, the overwhelming sense of dread that had filled the house. Charles, who had never been one to show fear, paled at Mark's words. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked in a hushed voice. Mark nodded. "La Lablesse, she was here." Charles's expression grew grim. "She's been here before," he said softly. "Years ago, I thought I saw her too, walking down the road late at night. I thought it was just a trick of the light, but I wasn't sure. I followed her, like an idiot. I thought it was someone I knew. But when I got close enough, I saw the hoof. I ran so fast. I didn't stop until I was home. That's why I stopped working the night shifts. I knew she was real. And she wanted me. Mark felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had heard rumors about La Lablesse growing up, but he never believed them. Now, standing in the dimly lit living room, he realized the truth. They were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. For the rest of the night, neither Mark nor Charles could sleep. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. They both sat in silence, listening to the night, the rustling of leaves outside, and the occasional creak of the house settling under the weight of its years. The next morning, Mark decided he couldn't stay in the house any longer. The fear had taken root in his bones. His uncle, too, had made up his mind. They left the village together, never to return to the house again. Mark would never forget the feeling of that night, the terror, the darkness, and the haunting figure of La Lablesse standing just out of reach, waiting for the moment when they would slip up and wander too far. It was a lesson, one Mark would carry with him for the rest of his life. Some stories are not just myths, and some creatures are very real. And they are waiting. Story: The Haunting of Blackthorn Manor. I had always been a logical person, the kind who dismissed ghost stories as nothing more than old wives' tales or the product of overactive imaginations. My parents, both scientists, raised me with a strict sense of rationality. They taught me that there was an explanation for everything, and if you couldn't find it immediately, it was simply because you didn't have the right knowledge yet. We were atheists, materialists, people who saw the world in black and white, with no room for the supernatural. That was until I started working at Blackthorn Manor. The manor was an old estate nestled on the edge of a quiet, rural town. It had stood there for over 2 centuries, surviving wars, economic collapse, and changes in ownership. The mansion itself was an imposing structure, with a grand facade of dark stone and ivy-clad walls that seemed to pulse with history. The sprawling grounds around the house were dotted with ancient oak trees, their twisted branches reaching out like arms trying to grab anyone who dared wander too close. I had heard rumors about the house before, the kind of stories you dismiss as local folklore. It was said that the manor was haunted, cursed, even a place where strange things happened, but no one really believed them. Not at first. I had moved to this small town for a fresh start after graduating from college. The job at Blackthorn Manor seemed like a perfect fit. They were looking for a live-in caretaker to manage the property, help with tours, and assist with the occasional event. The pay was decent, and the thought of living in a historic mansion intrigued me. I thought of it as a quirky way to start my new life, a step away from the dreary monotony of my previous existence. When I first arrived at the manor, it was everything I had imagined: old, grand, and full of character. The floors creaked beneath my feet, the wallpaper had a faded elegance, and the air inside the house smelled of old wood and dust, as if it had been trapped in time. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Hale, were a quiet couple in their late 50s who lived in a separate wing of the house. They were kind but distant, and they rarely interacted with me beyond the occasional greeting or small talk about the estate's upkeep. I spent most of my days cleaning the vast rooms, managing the grounds, and attending to the occasional guest or tour group that wandered through the house. But there was always something unsettling about the place. It wasn't the kind of place where people felt at ease. The house had a strange energy to it, one that seemed to pull at the edges of your mind when you weren't looking. I had been there for about 3 weeks when I first encountered something I couldn't explain. It was a late evening, just past sunset, and I was in the kitchen finishing up some cleaning. The house was quiet, as it often was after the last tour of the day. I always felt a sense of relief when the guests left for the night. They always seemed to bring an unease with them, as though they too could feel the weight of the house's history pressing in on them. As I wiped down the counters, I heard a sound coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old buildings often do. But then the sound came again, louder this time, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking across the hardwood floors above me. I froze. There was no one else in the house, at least not that I knew of. Mr. and Mrs. Hale were out for the evening, and there had been no guests staying overnight. My heart began to race as I slowly set the rag down on the counter and made my way to the staircase. The footsteps stopped when I reached the bottom of the stairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I slowly ascended, my breath shallow, and as I reached the top, the house was eerily silent again. I looked down the hallway, where my bedroom was, and at the end of the hall, I noticed something out of place. A door to a room that was supposed to be locked had been opened. It was a room that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, one that no one ever went into, as it was said to be filled with old furniture and the remnants of a long-forgotten time. I didn't know what made me walk toward the door. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something more. But as I approached, a chill ran down my spine, and the air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. I pushed the door open with a creak, half expecting to see nothing more than dust and cobwebs. But instead, I saw something that would change my perception of reality forever. In the center of the room stood an old rocking chair, rocking slowly back and forth as though someone had just been sitting there. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and I felt a shiver creep up my spine. As I stepped inside, the chair suddenly stopped. And then I heard it, whispering. Soft at first, like a faint murmur, but growing louder and clearer with each passing second. The voice seemed to be coming from nowhere, surrounding me, and though I couldn't understand the words, I felt them in my bones, like a presence that was reaching out to me. I turned and bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What had I just witnessed? What was in that room? I spent the rest of the night awake, the unsettling feeling never leaving me. I couldn't explain it away as the house settling or my imagination running wild. There was something in Blackthorn Manor, something that had been there long before I arrived. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. I kept myself busy, trying to avoid the room I had encountered. But no matter how hard I tried to push the experience out of my mind, it lingered, haunting me in the back of my thoughts. Things only worsened from there. Over the next few weeks, I began to experience more strange occurrences. Items would go missing, only to reappear in places I could have sworn I hadn't left them. The sound of someone breathing in the dark would wake me in the middle of the night, but when I turned on the light, the room was empty. The shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to move of their own accord, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. And the whispers, soft and insistent, began to grow louder and more frequent. It wasn't long before I started to hear the stories from the staff. Maggie, the housekeeper, who had worked at the manor for over 15 years, was the first to share her experience. She had been working late one night, cleaning the parlor, when she heard the sound of someone humming, a soft, familiar tune. At first, she thought it was just one of the guests, but when she entered the room, no one was there. The humming stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving her alone with the eerie silence. Maggie told me she wasn't the only one who had experienced strange occurrences. Other staff members spoke of hearing voices in the halls late at night, of seeing fleeting figures in the mirrors, and of witnessing objects moving on their own. One night, I decided to stay up after my shift ended, determined to get to the bottom of the strange happenings. I sat in the parlor, alone, waiting for something to reveal itself. I had no idea what I was hoping for, answers, perhaps, or maybe just an explanation. But what I got was something far worse. At exactly 3 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could see my breath misting in front of me. The furniture around me seemed to shift, though I knew it wasn't moving. And then, just as I was about to leave, the whispering began again. This time, the voice was clear, and it called my name. I turned, and standing in the doorway was a figure. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face obscured by a veil. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, as though she had been frozen in time. She took a step toward me, and I could feel my body locking up in fear. I couldn't move. Couldn't scream. "Get out," she whispered, her voice like a cold wind. "Leave this place before it's too late." I don't remember how I got out of the house, but I did. I ran, just like every other person before me who had felt the weight of Blackthorn Manor's curse. And I didn't look back. I left the manor the very next day. I never returned, and I haven't been able to step foot in that town again since. But as I sit here, years later, I still remember the coldness of her voice, the oppressive atmosphere of the house, and the feeling that there is something, somewhere, in the shadows, waiting to claim anyone foolish enough to stay too long. Now, I believe. And every time I hear the wind howl through the trees, I wonder if Blackthorn Manor is still calling out to me. Story: The Unseen Shift. My name is Max, and for the past 6 years, I've worked as a night shift supervisor at a small airport in Michigan. The airport's hangars have been standing since the late 1960s, and over time, the place has accumulated a lot of history, most of which no one cares to remember. I never thought much of it. My life was pretty simple. I worked, went home, lived an ordinary life. That was until the strange things started happening. I was always a skeptic. Raised in a practical, down-to-earth family, I never believed in ghosts, paranormal activity, or any of that nonsense. I dismissed stories of haunted places as nothing more than urban legends, just spooky tales people tell to spice up boring nights. But working at the airport night shift, I began to witness things I couldn't explain, things that started to challenge my worldview. It all began a few months after I started working third shift. There's a crew of 3 of us on nights, me, my colleague Terry, and the dispatcher, Susan. We mostly keep to ourselves, passing the hours with our routine checks of the hangar, monitoring the runways, and doing a lot of paperwork. The airport is relatively quiet, especially at night, which suits me just fine. But over the months, little things began to happen, things that shouldn't have. One night, Terry had to leave early because his wife, who was pregnant, needed him. That left Susan and me alone for the rest of the shift. Around 4 a.m., I was sitting in the break room, scrolling through my phone, trying to stay awake. The hangar was as quiet as always. But then, suddenly, there was a loud bang, a sound so intense it shook the walls. It was the kind of noise that made your heart skip a beat, the kind of sound you can't ignore. The bang echoed throughout the building, and Susan, who was in the dispatch room on the far side, came running toward me. She asked if I was all right, and I just stared at her, unsure of what had happened. My first thought was that a jack had given out on a plane and it had fallen. But when we checked the hangar, nothing was knocked over, and no equipment was out of place. The dispatcher called the police in a panic, fearing a break-in. But there was no sign of anyone. The noise had just appeared. We both stood there, staring at each other, trying to process what had just occurred. But neither of us had an explanation. And that wasn't the only strange thing that happened. The next incident occurred a few weeks later. I was in the restroom, washing up, when I saw Terry walking up the stairs into the office section of the hangar. He'd been in the restroom with me moments before, so I followed him, thinking maybe he'd forgotten something. When I reached the top of the stairs, I called out to him. "Terry?" I said. He turned around with a look of sheer terror on his face. I thought you were following me," he said, voice shaking. "I saw you go up the stairs. Ahead of me. Same coat, same hat, same everything." I felt my stomach drop. The figure he'd seen was dressed just like me, down to the worn Detroit Lions beanie I always wore, the one with the stain on the brim. But I hadn't gone upstairs before him, nor had anyone else. We searched the building, top to bottom, and found nothing. No one had entered or left the building. The only way in or out was through the dispatch room, and no one had passed through there either. That night, neither of us slept well. We stayed in the break room, trying to distract ourselves from the unease settling in. But it was becoming clear to me, something was going on in that hangar, something I couldn't explain. Then came the night in January. Fresh snow covered the ground, and the air was calm. It was around midnight when Susan and I heard a strange sound, like someone was shaking the door to the hangar, trying to get inside. We assumed it wasn't latched properly, so we went over to check. But as soon as we got close, the shaking stopped. We double-checked the door, made sure it was secure, and walked away. The moment we turned our backs, the door started shaking again, even more violently this time. We hurried back, but as soon as we neared, the shaking stopped. It felt like we were being taunted, as if whatever was causing it was watching us. We checked outside for footprints or any sign of someone messing with us, but the snow was undisturbed. There were no tracks, no signs of anyone nearby. We searched the entire perimeter of the building, but the snow was untouched. That night, we both felt a chill in the air that hadn't been there before. As weeks passed, the oddities became more frequent. We were still working the same routine, though we'd begun shutting off half the lights in the hangar due to budget cuts after the COVID-19 shutdown. The place felt darker, emptier. But with the lights off, something else started to happen. I began seeing strange shapes in my peripheral vision, dark masses that seemed to move in and out of the shadows. The most unsettling of them appeared one night near the toolboxes. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, but then it moved, a slow, creeping shadow the size of a softball. It slid out from under the toolbox and started inching toward me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I looked back, the shadow was gone. It had retreated back under the toolbox, just like that. Another night, I walked past the break room, and I saw someone sitting in the chair at the picnic table. The person was facing away from me, their boots up on the bench. It was just the lower half of their body that I could see, brown boots, faded jeans. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. When I turned on the light, there was no one there. I checked the room, and there was no sign of anyone having been there. At this point, I was starting to lose sleep. The hallucinations, or whatever they were, began to feel too real. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The worst incident came shortly after. It was mid-afternoon, around 3 p.m., when I woke up from a nap in the break room. I'd been struggling with sleep paralysis for the first time in my life. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. But there, in the doorway, stood a dark figure, just a black shape, taller than anyone I'd ever seen, standing in the doorway watching me. I tried to scream, to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The figure stayed there for what felt like an eternity before vanishing, leaving me shaking and cold, still unable to move. The final straw came 2 days ago. I was sitting with Terry, drinking coffee, when a loud crash echoed through the hangar. We both jumped up, startled. A 5-foot-long piece of quarter-inch trim had fallen off a shelf and landed 10 feet away from where it had been resting. There was no sign that it had been moved or hanging off the edge. We both saw it fall, and we both saw where it landed. But neither of us could explain how it happened. There was no breeze, no reason why the trim should have fallen. I don't know what to make of all this anymore. I feel like I'm losing my grip on reality. I've always believed that there's a logical explanation for everything, but I can't find one for this. Terry swears he hasn't experienced anything like this, and Susan is quiet on the matter. She doesn't want to talk about it, but I know she's seen the strange things too. We just don't want to admit it, because we don't know what to do with the truth. The strange noises, the figures, the feeling of being watched, it's like the hangar is alive with something we can't see. But it's real. I've seen it with my own eyes. And now I'm left to wonder, what's next? I don't know if there's a logical explanation for any of this. I want to believe that there is. But a part of me knows the truth. Whatever is happening here isn't something that can be easily explained away. And as much as I try to deny it, I feel like I'm starting to believe in things I never thought I would. I don't know how much longer I can keep working the night shift at this airport. But I know one thing for sure, the things I've seen, they're real. And I don't think they're done with me yet. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.